It is evident both from Maya texts and monuments, as well as some other archaeological findings, that warfare played an important role in Maya civilization. During most of their history, the fragmented Maya states were locked in an almost perpetual state of war amongst themselves. Not even the foreign threats, like the ones coming from Teotihuacan or the Aztecs, could make the Maya call a truce and unite against the common enemy. When the Spaniards came, the Yucatan Maya recognized how dangerous the Europeans were. But even then, the urge to settle old scores was too great for peace and unity to last longer than a couple of years. It would be expected that something as crucial to the Maya as war would be well documented and fully understood by the historians, but that is not the case. Not much is known about logistics, the organization of the military, or their training, as they are not described or even mentioned in texts and carvings. Monuments sometimes contain depictions of battles, but mostly they focus on celebrating victories and mentioning wars waged by the Maya kings. This lack of concrete evidence hasn't discouraged archaeologists and historians in their attempt to uncover at least some mysteries of Maya warfare. One of the certainties of Maya warfare is that the rulers were supreme war captains, as evident from the monuments. In the pre-classic period, rulers were depicted, and in some cases even buried, with trophy heads on their belts. Those represented the sacrificed captives. That imagery later disappeared, and rulers were represented standing on their captives. Sometimes, even queens would be shown in the same way. Prisoners of war were important to the Maya kings, as it was a way of proving one's worth to both the gods and subordinates. Some documents testify that before a ruler could be crowned, he had to capture at least one prisoner for sacrifice. In some scenes, even the royal ancestors, dressed as warriors, are depicted advising the current ruler on the battlefield. The religious importance of sacrifices, especially of the captives, persisted until the time of the conquistadors, giving one explanation why warfare was important to the Maya and their kings. It also helps illustrate why wars apparently never stopped in the Maya world, and why rulers often took the titles like He of 20 Captives. Despite all the carvings and text representing various rulers, some historians claimed that the Maya rulers weren't really participating in battles. They were simply commanders-in-chief, not soldiers. They saw depictions as pure propaganda. Disregarding scenes of kings involved in hand-to-hand combat, the fact that many inscriptions mention rulers that were captured in battle and sacrificed later disproves this theory. Even the Spaniards mention that some of the royal family's heads fought against them in direct combat. It was also the European conquerors who noted some of the organization and hierarchy of the late post-classic Maya military. Spaniards mention a non-hereditary military title of Nacom. This rank was not permanent, but held for a short period of time, not longer than the duration of a particular war, similar to the title of dictator in the ancient Roman Republic. Their task was to gather and organize the army, while also performing certain religious rituals that were likely formerly done by the ruler himself. A Necom from the Yucatan did not personally lead the troops into the fight, but only acted as a chief military strategist. But in the Quiche kingdom, Necom also led the troops into battle, supported by 4 captains under his command. Those captains were likely ranked as Batab, a title that was given to the rulers and governors of dependent towns and sites within the state. The Spaniards recorded that their obligation was to lead the local armies into battle under the supreme command of their ruler, or in this case, an officer representing the ruler. Historians have linked the responsibilities and duties to the late classical period title of Sahal, also given to the rulers of vassal cities. Another classical period military rank that has been deciphered is the title of Bate. Its true nature remains hidden, but it seems it has something to do with war captives and their sacrifice. This title has been held by both the ruler and the elite warriors, but it's also been attributed to some noble women. Although there are some mentions of women assisting in war, they were never mentioned as military officers. So it seems that Bate was a more honorific and hereditary title, given to a person or a family that demonstrated worth in combat. The things that connects all known military officers is they were all restricted to the members of the elite, whether they were hereditary or not. This was probably due to the fact that only nobles had any possibility to practice the art of war and of strategy. But having nobles serve as military officers was also beneficial to the ruler and to the state, as they could raise a large number of warriors through their kinship, tribute relations, and direct control of their lands. This can be compared to feudal lords in European medieval kingdoms. A major difference between the Maya noble officers and the European knights is that in the Maya society, a commoner could advance through both military and social ranks if he could prove his prowess in warfare. Historians today can't be sure how common that type of advancement was, but it is clear that below the officers came the majority of common soldiers. The Maya didn't have a standing army, but some sources suggest that they had a small group of warriors stationed in larger settlements, always prepared for battle. Whether these were commoners or a member of the elite is uncertain. Whatever was the case, Spaniards report that every attempted surprise attack on the ports was met by a group of the Maya prepared to fight. The regular Maya soldiers were actually conscripts, most likely gathered by their local governors or lords. Their military service may also have been a part of the corvée labor duties. Service of the common folk was especially needed in time of the full-scale wars, when the majority of the adult male population was conscripted to fight for their king and their state. It is likely they brought their own weapons, used in the peacetime for hunting, and it seems that hunting was the only training a commoner got, which was later expanded by his own experience from previous military campaigns he was involved in. During periods of war, another type of soldier used were mercenaries. Better trained, yet less loyal, they were in some cases a decisive factor in the course of the war. Their payments were given to them by the war captains, who bought their services, but the common citizens housed and fed them. Mercenaries, as well as the officers and common recruits, brought their own weapons on the battlefield. The most commonly depicted weapon on the monuments is probably the atlatl, or spear thrower. This weapon was brought to the Maya world from central Mexico by Teotihuacanos from around the 4th century AD. It was a major improvement, as the javelin or a dart, with its sharpened chert or obsidian tip, could hit a target from a distance of about 45 meters or 150 feet, with at least twice as much force and better accuracy than if it was done by simply throwing. It should be noted that some historians think that the use of the atlatl was limited, due to its impracticality in the jungle terrain, claiming that its depictions were common only as a symbol of power borrowed from Teotihuacan art. Besides the spear thrower, the Maya also used blowguns, which were used both hunting and in war. This weapon was more likely used by the commoners, as it was cheaper to make and required less training. The bow and arrow were also known as far back as the Classical era, but it was not until post-Classic times that it became a common weapon on the battlefield. It was also more commonly associated with the non-elite soldiers, who used reed arrows pointed with flints or sharp fish teeth. Besides those, the Maya used a variety of hand-to-hand weapons. The Maya soldiers commonly used wooden spears, axes, and clubs, which were all commonly fitted with razor-sharp obsidian spikes or blades. They had knives and daggers, also made from sharpened obsidian or flint. For Europeans, the lack of metal weapons was strange, and they considered it rather primitive. But the Maya, by the time of the arrival of the first Spaniards, already used copper blades, albeit on a limited scale. In general, they tended to stick with stone cutting edges, since obsidian was far more common, cheaper, and more durable, and easier to convert into sharp blades. Also, there was nothing primitive about the obsidian blade, for Christopher Columbus himself noted that the Maya weapons cut as well as the Spanish steel. The Maya warriors were often further equipped with shields. The type of shield used depended mainly on the weapon a soldier was carrying. If armed with a spear, a Maya fighter would usually carry a rectangular flexible shield made out of leather and cotton. Their defensive capabilities were limited, and these shields were most likely used to protect from projectiles and give more passive protection to the body. It was most likely that the spear provided both attacking strikes and active defensive parrying. And historians think these spearmen were the most common type of Maya warriors utilized in battles, making them the core of the army. Axe or club-wielding soldiers were less common and were most likely to be used to complement the spearmen in battle, or perhaps they were given more specialized tasks. They were also more valuable in small raids on lightly armored enemies. These types of warriors also carried shields. Usually those were round and more rigid, made out of leather, wood, and in some cases even tortoise shells. As they were smaller and tightly strapped to the arm, their main use was in parrying the blows of the enemy, as the shorter clubs and axes weren't adequate for that purpose. This type of shield eschewed a larger, more protective size in favor of smaller but more maneuverable form. This, to a degree, lessened the amount of protection the shield provided a warrior. Archaeologists have also found a third type of shield, which was rigid, large, and rectangular. It was usually made out of wood, leather, or woven reeds. This was a Central American introduction, and it was more common in that area. But historians assume it was usually made out of wood, leather, or woven reeds. This was a Central American introduction, and it was more common in that area. But historians assume its use was limited, mostly intended as a sign of power and prestige. This theory comes from the shield's impracticality in the thick jungles of the Maya homeland, and also from the fact that the shields were commonly associated with the Mexican-style iconography and gods, giving the shields more value as a status symbol. It seems that helmets were also somewhat symbolic. They were usually worn by higher-ranking officers, and although they probably offered some added protection, their main use was to represent the status of the wearer. In the post-classic era, those helmets, usually made out of wood, were adorned with various emblems, effigies, and feathers. Ones from the classical period were even less protective and more aesthetic. Those were more elaborate wooden and cloth headdresses that most likely represented the spirit animal of the warrior. Carrying the symbolism even further were the kings. In some cases, the Maya rulers would dress in ritual war costumes to inspire their troops. This clothing would offer some added protection, but would be too impractical for combat. That's why it wasn't a common practice and was most likely used in cases when the king wasn't directly involved in the actual fighting. In more usual depictions of rulers in battle, they wore more suitable clothing for protection, like quilted cotton vests and jaguar pelt leggings. They also carried elaborate jaguar headdresses and shields adorned with the symbols of the jaguar sun god, a Maya deity of war and the underworld. Despite the fact that kings were sometimes depicted wearing quilted cotton armor, its usage doesn't seem to have been that common. Most of the common warriors are depicted wearing nothing but a loincloth. So it seems that, at least in the classical era, cotton armor was reserved for the nobles. This may have changed in the post-classic era, as there are records that the Spaniards had been dropping their own steel plates to switch with the Maya cotton tunics. This may indicate that more than just a few noblemen wore it, but it also proves how effective it was. It provided more than sufficient protection against obsidian-based arms, though conquistador sources indicate that it was a little bit less effective against steel weapons. But its major advantages were that it was lighter, more suitable for the high temperatures of the region, and that it was more flexible, making soldiers more mobile than if they were wearing steel armor. Alas, that type of protection wasn't available to the commoners. Since they fought bare-chested, they often applied body paint on themselves. Reasons for that can be found in possible religious ceremonies, to differentiate themselves from the enemy, or even as a psychological warfare tactic to frighten the opponents. The exact tactics used by the Maya generals on the battlefields are unknown to us as there are no records about them. Some historians argue that the lack of banners and standards point to the fact that they fought out of formation. Supporting evidence for this theory is the fact that dense jungles are not suitable terrain for armies to maintain order. What military historians assume, according to the types of weapon and equipment used by the Maya, is that typical battles started with volleys from projectile weapons. These were aimed at weakening the enemy, both physically and mentally. Then, the main combatants of the armies would collide in hand-to-hand combat in a simple, straightforward clash. Winners of these battles would be the ones with the bigger armies, better equipment, and ultimately higher morale and will to fight. Of course, this can't discount the possibility that at least some Maya strategists used more complex tactics, like encirclement or ambushes. Historians simply don't have the evidence to confirm that possibility. Not all Maya battles were in the wilderness, since an important tactic of Maya warfare was carrying out city raids. In some situations, the cities that were attacked were defenseless. For example, a defending city's main army might have been defeated prior to the urban attack. The attacking army could then just plow through the city, burning, pillaging, and causing destruction. But the cities weren't always left without any protection. In those cases, the broad streets and open plazas most likely turned into a fractioned battlefield. Of course, the fate of the city and its citizens depended on the results of that battle. As these attacks on the urban centers became more frequent, defenders started building various defensive structures which altered the way those cities were attacked. There's no evidence of siege equipment needed to break through the defenses, so it seems that the main tactic was a blockade. An attacking army would try to cut off the city's supplies and hope that the defender would eventually yield. Proficiency of the Maya in the use of this tactic was confirmed by the Spaniards, who were actually defeated by it during their attack on Yucatan in 1533 AD. Their camp was surrounded, cut off from supplies. Unable to find food or water, they were forced to run away during the night in an attempt to save their lives. Other possible siege tactics may have been used, like surprise attacks, catching the enemy defenses off guard. Perhaps people in settlements may have been bribed to allow attacking armies entrance. Yet again, these tactics can't be concretely verified by the sources, so they remain the object of speculation. What is clearly evident are the remains of the fortifications used to defend cities from the attacks. It seems that initially, the most common types of defense were ditches and moats created by diverting the agricultural canals. Some historians argue that moats weren't mainly defensive, but were only used as water reservoirs for the city. Both theories about the use of the moats are plausible. In peacetime, people could have used them as a water source. But during an attack, moats would present a major obstacle for invading forces. Walls were also built, and some were up to 11 meters, or 36 feet, high. There were fewer doubts about their purpose, as they are clearly made to be part of the fortifications. Some have argued that the walls were erected to separate the nobility from the commoners, but it doesn't seem likely as it goes against the Maya idea of open public spaces for rituals and ceremonies. One of the best examples of walls being used for defense can be found at Dos Pilas, where they were built in haste from the materials that comprised their religious buildings. Defenders constructed 2 concentric walls to create a 20 to 30 meter wide, 66 to 99 feet, killing zone. When the attackers breached the gates, they were caught between the 2 walls and became easy targets for the defenders on the inner wall. Archaeologists have dug out numerous projectile points at this location, while burials of decapitated adult males were found just outside the walls. This proves just how effective and bloody the Maya defensive tactics and fortifications could be. But as it was already mentioned, in the end they weren't enough to save the city. Other cities that shared a similar fate with Dos Pilas made crude rubble barricades in times of urgency. Of course, those types of defensive structures were less efficient. Another type of protective structure were wooden palisades, sometimes reaching to heights of 9 meters or 30 feet. If they weren't built in haste because of an impending attack, the palisades could have been covered with a plaster to prevent them from catching on fire easily. During the Terminal Classic and Post-Classic period, there was another important leap in fortification systems. Walls became fitted with wider ramparts, parapets, and interior walkways. This came about due to the increased usage of archers in war, since they could fire from greater distances. From the tops of the walls, defenders could use the threat of archers to keep attackers farther away. During this period, defensive systems became more complex, being created in multiple rings of defense, with the last ring protecting the sacred and most important city center. But besides making defenses go deeper inwards, some of the cities created smaller forts outside the city's limits. These were used as the first perimeter of defense, to lessen the chance of surprise attacks. Yet, no matter how complex and efficient these defenses were, it seemed that, in the end, nothing could really protect the Maya cities from the troubles of war. All of them eventually suffered defeat. The Maya continued to try to prevent those fatal outcomes. Yet another way they tried to improve the defensive capabilities of their settlements was by utilizing the landscape. This became more common in the post-classic era, especially in the highlands. There, many cities and fortifications were erected on the hilltops, which made access to them difficult. Sometimes the only way to get near the city was a narrow path, easily controlled by the defenders. Other times, a city was surrounded by a ravine, which could only be crossed by a plank bridge that defenders could remove. But fortifications like these became more of a citadel type, used primarily for defenses and not as dwellings. In the lowlands, the main use of natural defenses were islands on the lakes and coasts, which couldn't be crossed without a canoe or a ship. The Spaniards have also mentioned the use of traps as defensive measures. One example of that was the Maya trying to lure the conquistadors onto a narrow pathway and then cutting off the exits. The idea was to defeat them in a high space where their horses were unable to maneuver, making them easy targets for both archers and spearmen. Another important question that needs to be answered is why warfare was so important for the Maya. This is best explained by analyzing the types of wars they waged, or more precisely by determining what the main goal was to be achieved by the attackers. Most commonly, the Maya states went to war in the attempt to expand their territories and influence. This was done for economic gain, mostly through control of trade routes and resources, and additionally to attain political advancement. Wars could be motivated by the desire to defeat an ally or a vassal of an enemy state, by quests to remove a dynasty, by the urge to improve the political strength of one's own state, or even revenge in some cases. Added benefits of successful wars were the tributes paid by conquered cities. Revenge sometimes gave war other dimensions, transforming a confrontation from a territorial conflict into a mission of destruction. This was less common, as it obviously didn't yield as many benefits as conquering. If it was done, it was usually a culmination of years of animosity and hostility. The best example of this was Dos Pilas, which was destroyed without any signs that the attackers had tried to conquer or subdue it. Another example of a destruction war was when Chichen Itza annihilated one of its competitors in maritime trade. There was no motivation for revenge, but the simple calculation that a competitor needed to be destroyed without giving any chance of later revival. Recovery would have been possible if it was merely turned into a vassal city. But gains and revenge weren't the only reasons for the Maya to go to war. Another crucial motivation was religion and rituals. As we have learned, it was an important part of the ruler's image to be presented with captives to be used in the ceremonial sacrifices needed to please the gods. Catching those victims was certainly one of the motivations for Maya wars. Though it should be emphasized that, unlike the previous belief of archaeologists, this wasn't the main cause of war. With common wars being fought regularly, most states didn't lack the captives for those needs. But in some cases, when Maya kings needed to prove themselves and acquire sacrificial victims, it could lead to conflict. though not likely full-scale war. And though religion wasn't often a cause of war, it certainly was commonly used to justify it. The Maya would often look at the night sky, looking at the movement of Venus, which was associated with war. Wars were typically waged when it was visible in the sky. Indeed, these wars have been marked with a Star War glyph on the monuments and texts. This meant that the war was sanctioned as a divine mission, similarly to the Crusades or Jihad. It was commonly used as justification for territorial warfare, making so-called Star Wars not uncommon occurrences. It could be noted that the economy was one of the important drives of the Maya civilization. It was a base which propelled their polities from chiefdoms to states. It allowed the expansion of culture and great architectural achievements. Because of it, wars were started and ended. Even the Maya realized how important the economy was to them, especially in the late post-classic period when their society turned to rapid commercialism. To fully understand the Maya history, development, and culture, one has to get to know how their economy worked as well. It started from its early tribal background of hunting and foraging, then switched to farming when the Maya ancestors chose a sedentary way of life. Since then, the founding of the Maya economy was agriculture. Early on, during the pre-classic age, the Maya figured out that water management was the key for both better and more reliable harvests. That is why they built wells, canals, and in some extreme cases, like Kaminaljuyu, created massive irrigation systems. Besides those, it was common to create water reservoirs from natural and man-made subterranean caves, as well as quarry pits that were lined with clay to make them more watertight. In some cases, in Yucatan, the Maya even developed the natural water-retaining depressions and cultivated water lilies to slow down the water evaporation. Droughts weren't the only problem the Maya faced in agriculture. Flooding and heavy rains were also troubling, but the canals and other water management systems also drained water. Where there was no need for canals, they used the drain and raise technique, where the fields were covered in a network of drainage ditches which took away the excess water, while simultaneously earth dug up from the ditches was piled on the same fields, elevating them from the floodplain. Another problem faced by the Maya farmers was maintaining the fertility of the soil. They used various techniques for that, from planting complementary species near each other, like beans and maize, to fertilizer made from household refuse and crop rotation. The Maya farmers also used swidden agriculture methods, but this was primarily used to create new fields. And although altogether these approaches to preservation of soil show a real understanding of agriculture, it wasn't enough to maintain food supplies when the population grew too much. Thus, many of the fertile fields were overused and depleted by the time the Classic era was coming to an end. Nonetheless, the Maya agriculture endured, while farmers searched for new fertile soils in which to plant their crops. Those can be divided into two major groups: food crops and export or cash crops. Major food crops were maize, manioc, squash, sweet potato, papaya, pineapple, avocado, tomatoes, chili peppers, and common beans. Besides those, the Maya also grew some medicinal herbs in smaller house gardens. And although the food was sometimes traded, main trade income would have come from the cash crops. Most important of those was probably cacao, which was highly sought after by the higher classes for making of chocolate beverages. Cacao was also linked to the gods, and it even served as a currency to a certain extent. Another important crop was cotton, which, thanks to the climate, grew well in the Yucatan region. Unlike cacao, cotton was most commonly turned into a finished textile product before being exported, and it was an important source of income. A third major cash crop was the agave plant, which was used to produce hemp fibers for inexpensive commoners' clothing and sandals, as well as strong ropes. Additionally, they cultivated tobacco, which was used for both religious rituals and individual pleasure. Despite the development of agriculture, hunting and foraging also remained sources of food and income for the Maya. Animals that were hunted ranged from large deer through peccaries and monkeys to quail and partridge. They also hunted for crocodiles and manatees. For larger game, the Maya hunters mainly used spears and bows, while for monkeys and birds they used blowguns. They also employed traps, which were mainly used to catch tapirs and armadillos, as well as turtles and iguanas, who, in addition to meat, were a source of highly favored eggs. As with farming, not all animals were hunted for food. Jaguars, macaws, and quetzals were primarily hunted for their feathers, claws, pelts, and teeth, which were in high demand by the nobles for clothing and accessories. That made them valuable trade items. But the jungle was also suitable for foraging, giving the Maya more food like mushrooms, sometimes hallucinogenic, and various berries, as well as greens like tree spinach and radish-like root plants. Rainforests were also sources of medicinal herbs and spices, like oregano and allspice. They also gathered vanilla pods, both for flavoring and fragrance, sometimes even cultivating vanilla vines deep in the tropical jungle. Of course, the Maya also fished, both on seacoasts and further inland, and on lakes and rivers. They caught shrimp, lobster, various shellfish, and fish. The ocean-sourced fish were sometimes salted and traded as a delicacy to interior regions. All of the previously listed economic activities were fairly common around the world, so it's not surprising that the Maya practiced them as well. What can be a bit of a shock is that the animal husbandry was never truly developed by the Maya. They only domesticated dogs for hunting and as pets, while turkeys and Muscovy ducks were only semi-domesticated. In some cases, they would capture and hold deer for a while before eating it later, but the Maya did practice beekeeping, especially in Yucatan. There, they would make hives from hollowed tree trunks, which they plugged on the end. Honey was important as the only known sweetener to the Maya, which made it both an important part of the diet and a valuable trade item. But more important than sweet honey was salt, necessary to maintaining life. And although nearly all the Maya that lived on the coast were producing it, Yucatan salt was most valued and produced in much larger quantities. It was sought after even by the central Mexican nobility. Another product that was in some cases reserved for nobility was alcoholic beverages, mostly consumed during feasts and rituals. The most famous examples of Maya alcoholic drinks, which are still made today, are balche, a mild liquor, and chicha, a maize beer. The second major branch of the Maya economy was crafting and artisanal work. The range of those products, as well as skills of the makers, went from simple and crude to exquisite artistry. And though most of them were commoners, highly skilled artisans often rose to the middle class, while even some of the nobles practiced forms of craftwork. Of all the products those craftsmen made, ceramics were probably the most important for the economy. First of all, ceramics were essential in everyday life, everything from cooking pots to storage jugs. These goods varied in quality, beauty, and shape, but if they were painted and adorned, they served a more ornamental role, like vases and figurines. Then ceramics became a rather important trade commodity, highly valued by the nobility. Importance of ceramics in the Maya society can be further demonstrated by the fact that they developed a means of mass producing it. They created molds from which they made copies of the same product, from which even artistic figurines were made. And if needed, the blank canvas of those products could be embellished or individualized through painting or adding handmade details. Most important is the fact that mass production meant that ceramics were getting easier to make, cheaper, and more available. They were useful in trade, both for carrying other goods and as an item of trade itself. Those who painted the ceramics, depending on their skill and quality of their work, could in some cases even be considered artistic, while others are more artisans and simple painters. They all used a variety of brushes and tools that resembled the wooden stylus of the ancient Near East. Those, with other tools and weapons, were another important part of the craftsmanship of the Maya pre-industrial workers. The toolmakers' main resources were, as already mentioned, obsidian and chert. Those tools were part of the ceramics trade, but also necessary as a consumer good. Toolmakers also made wooden weaving battens, handles, and levers, while bones were used for the needles and fishing hooks. For heavier work tools, such as chisels, scrapers, grinding stones, and axes, they used basalt. Those types of tools were commonly used and are found at all sites. But precise work tools, like micro-drills needed for the finest lapidary work, are found only at the elite quarters of the urban centers. This indicates that those artisans were either of noble descent or were held in high regard by the ruling class. Again, it shows how some parts of the craft industry were appreciated in the Maya society, at least in the classical period. By the post-classic period, around 13th century AD, toolmakers embraced a new technology and resource for their products. They started using copper to create axes, fishing hooks, and tweezers. This debunks one of the most common myths that the Maya didn't have any knowledge of metallurgy. The truth is that copper wasn't that much better than the stone tools they created. And in their region, there weren't any copper mines, but obsidian, chert, and basalt were present in abundance. The only metal they had was gold, and it was panned in small quantities in the highlands. Most of their precious metals were traded from the southern parts of Mesoamerica, and those were usually imported as finished products. While there were some gold and silver artifacts that were most likely created by the Maya craftsmen, it seemed that they didn't develop many such skills. They focused on working with precious stones, which were also abundant in the Maya homeland. Jade, serpentine, turquoise, and pyrite were most commonly used. From those, they fashioned jewelry, home decorations, figurines, and other pieces of art. Pyrite was specifically used in creating divining mirrors. Of these, jade was both the most precious and also the hardest to work with. Historians today find it remarkable that the Maya artisans were able to work jade without any metal tools, and think that great skill and dedication was needed to produce high quality from that particular stone. The Maya craftsmen also used red shells and bones to make jewelry and other artwork. All of these products were highly valued in trade. Another tradable item was cotton clothing. As mentioned, cotton was grown by the Maya farmers, but expert weavers did the processing. They used a variety of complicated techniques to create pieces of cotton fabric used to make clothing. It was reserved for the nobles, in some cases even used as tributes and gifts to the royalty. They were adorned with various abstract symbols, most often connected with cosmological and religious motifs. In some cases, feathers were also woven into the clothing, which was commonly colorful. They used dyes made from plants, insects, and shells, and the most commonly used colors were dark blue, red, purple, and black purple. Weavers also produced cotton tapestries and brocades as decoration and as art. All of this indicates that the textile enterprise was another important part of the Maya economy. Of course, that type of highly priced cotton textile was reserved for the elite. In some rare cases, the Maya commoners had clothing made of lesser quality homespun cotton, but more often they wore simple loincloths made from various hemp fibers. Another type of common attire was pounded bark cloth, which some historians argue was used only for ceremonial occasions. A more interesting use of pounded bark material was for making a crude version of paper. This Mesoamerican paper, referred to as such because its exact origin is unknown, was usually made from wild fig bark, which was boiled in maize water, treated with lime or ash, then peeled in thin leaves. Those leaves were laid crisscross on a wooden board, then beaten with a stone into a single sheet of paper. Finishing with a thin layer of plaster ensured that the final product was smooth enough to write on. The most notable use of this paper was for writing books and codices. which were unfortunately almost all destroyed by the Spaniards. But Mesoamerican paper was also likely used in rituals and for keeping records of trading, tributes, and other state business. The Maya made other products from plant fibers and vines, most noticeably mats, baskets, and fans. Mats were connected with a ruler and with authority, making them at least symbolically important. Baskets were in most cases used as an everyday item for carrying various items, but in some situations they were linked with ceremonies and sacrificial offerings to the gods. After listing all the important products of the two major branches of the Maya economy, it is time to turn our attention to the third branch, which created nothing except profit. Of course, this branch is trading. By now, it should be clear that a lot of Maya life revolved around trade, and historians think it was the most important motor that drove the advance and growth of the Maya civilization. Most of the strongest Maya states drew strength from the control of the trade routes, and they often fought for them. But trade also facilitated connection with both other regions of the Maya homeland and also with other surrounding nations. As a result, the Maya weren't only exchanging goods, but also ideas, technologies, and beliefs. That is one of the reasons why historians have been so focused on the long-distance, interregional trade that connected the present-day New Mexico with Panama and Colombia. The Maya held the central position of that trade. They exported and imported nearly all the resources and products mentioned in this chapter, except food. They also imported resources not commonly found in their homeland, like silver, gold, pearls, copper, rubber, turquoise, etc. But the Maya traders also played a role of middleman in the trade between northern and southern Mesoamerica, and in some cases even larger areas. This is not to say that a single Maya merchant traveled from Panama to New Mexico. Long-distance trading was done in stages, like a relay race, where the goods could be carried by a single trader only for one part of the route. Yet, the Maya merchants did have an enclave in early classic Teotihuacan, 1,600 kilometers or about 1,000 miles from their homeland. And this close connection with central Mexico continued when the Aztecs became the major power in the region. Another important factor of interregional trade is that it reinforced the authority and prestige of the ruler, as the royal family most often controlled the vital resources traded by the Maya. So, when the Maya traded for luxury goods, acquired products went to the ruler, and in some cases the highest elite. That way, the king and nobles were the ones profiting from most of this type of trade. Of course, this wasn't the only kind of commerce. There was also a regional trade between the Maya themselves. As was already mentioned, not all regions of the Maya homeland were suitable for producing everything, or had access to the same raw materials. That is why there is a need for cities to complement each other with various products. The best example would be the exchange of obsidian products for salt between the highlands and Yucatan states. These trade connections were obviously strong, and so frequent that they kept the Maya tightly connected in one rather homogeneous civilization. This was facilitated by the rulers, who of course benefited from trade. They sponsored and organized markets in their city centers, trying to attract more people to trade on their land. Although archaeologists aren't completely sure, it is likely that the large and permanent Maya markets were under strict government control. Its officials enforced rules, settled disputes, and of course collect taxes. Naturally, these central markets were also used by the local population to acquire the goods they needed, and it is also likely that smaller and less permanent local markets existed, which were used for local trade. This third type of trading was used between neighbors, trading among themselves for produce they lacked. All the families were focused and specialized on one type of production, so they created surpluses which they traded for items that they were missing. This type of trade wasn't that profitable and wasn't done by the professional merchants. It was the common people who bartered among each other. It is also likely that it wasn't as regulated as the higher levels of trade. Yet it was important for the survival of the local communities and the common citizens. By getting familiar with all three levels or types of trading, as well as the reach of the merchants, it is possible to make a general idea of how the Maya trade network looked. But there is another important issue regarding this network yet to be discussed: the transport of goods. The first method to develop, and more commonly employed in the local and partially in regional trade, was overland transport. Without any animals to facilitate land transport, it was all done by human porters. In some cases, they carried the goods on their back. In other, 2 or more of them would carry a litter. These would also be used to transport richer travelers. These carriers used trails and sakbeob when they existed on their routes. Relay teams were used to make the transport faster and easier, especially if the cargo was heavy or if the final destination was further away. But in any case, this type of transportation was rather hard, slow, and, in essence, inefficient. That is why the Maya used water transport wherever they could. It was first done using rivers, connecting the inland cities. But as shipbuilding technology improved and the Maya commerce began to expand further and further away, they also started to use the sea for transport. For that, they used canoes, which by the beginning of the 16th century were about 2.5 meters or 8 feet wide and as long as galleys, according to the accounts of Columbus's son. Their vessels were fitted with palm canopies to protect passengers and goods. In the same description, it was stated that Maya canoes could carry up to 25 people on board, which means they carried substantial amounts of cargo as well. That fact also pushed the expansion of the sea trade, which led to the rise of up to 150 ports on the Yucatan coast in the post-classic period. This, of course, caused a lot of the classical-era lowlanders' trade centers to lose their power and importance. But throughout the period, some aspects of trade didn't change much. One of those was a payment system. It seems the most common currency was cacao beans. They were deemed valuable, and there were some reports of counterfeiting them by filling an empty cacao shell with dirt. Yet exactly how the Maya governments controlled its value and protected the cacao as a type of money remains an enigma for historians. Besides paying with cacao, it seems some other luxury items were also used for payments, also with what seemed to have been fixed market values. These were jade beads and oyster shells. Later on, with the introductions of metals, the Maya merchants also started using copper and gold. Of course, barter was also a common form of payment, especially in local markets. To ensure the trade deals would go through without problems, the Maya merchants even created contracts, especially for larger or more valuable exchanges. These contracts might have been only oral since they were sealed by public drinking. This may have given rise to a culture of traders' integrity, as the Spaniards have observed that the Maya merchants were rather honorable. They also noted that usury didn't exist among them. All these factors combined demonstrate that the Maya trade was quite complex and very organized, not at all primitive as was once thought. That, combined with the developed agriculture and craft production, makes it apparent that the Maya had a robust and diverse economy. It shows yet another part of the Maya civilization that